Yes, my name is Mark Hefflinger. I'm the communications director for Bold Alliance. We fight pipelines and big corporations that threaten our land and water and build clean energy projects that benefit rural communities. Bold Alliance is a network of small and mighty groups in rural states working against eminent domain abuse, clean energy solutions while building an engaged base of citizens who care about the land, water, and climate change. You may remember Bold from Bold, Nebraska and the Keystone XL fight. Currently, we're operating the Pipeline Fighters Hub, and I am publishing the daily extracted email newsletter. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Carolyn Raffensberger. She is the executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. And we're here to talk about a report co-authored by folks from Bold and SEN today called The False Promise and Potential Health Harms of Carbon Dioxide Enhanced Oil Recovery as a Tool of Climate Mitigation. And thanks for moderating, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for being here. It really is a privilege to introduce this remarkable group of panelists and authors of the report. And I work for the Science and Environmental Health Network, which was put together by many of the environmental groups in the country about 30 years ago to address the use and misuse of science and environmental and public health policy. And we are often, the work that we do is essentially a service for the larger environmental community to help translate scientific information so that grassroots groups have access to both scientific and then its implications for public scientific information and its implications for public policy and their on-the-ground struggles. And so we were part of this effort to put together a report on enhanced oil recovery. And what we are going to tell you about today is what its impact is on climate, where this whole idea has come from, and then what its public health implications are as well. So Illinois passed a law earlier this year that expressly said that enhanced oil recovery is not in the public interest. And we are here to tell you why that is actually the right answer. Enhanced oil recovery is not a public benefit. It is not in the public interest. And so our report lays out the reasons that we can assert that. We are going to first hear from Paul Blackburn, an attorney, expert on pipelines and lots of energy things. He is an advisor to the Bold Alliance and one of the key authors of this particular report. He will pass it over to Sandra Steingraber, a biologist and senior scientist with the Science and Environmental Health Network, and she'll be talking about climate and enhanced oil recovery. She'll pass it on to Ted Shetler, who's the science director for the Science and Environmental Health Network. And Ted is trained in public health, and he's a physician. So then Ted will pass it to Jim Walsh, the policy director for Food and Water Watch, and a leader in the work on carbon capture and storage and fossil fuels at the federal level. So he'll be talking about the implications of the report for public policy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Blackburn.
Thanks, Carolyn. I hope you've all had a chance to download the report. And I just wanted to walk you through the structure very briefly, just so you have some orientation around it. In order to understand enhanced oil recovery and how it fits into this overall scheme, it's important. We decided it was important to understand something about petroleum geology and how petroleum extraction works. So the report first walks through petroleum geology and then in the extraction process. And then it describes enhanced oil recovery operations, and it describes the need for anthropogenic CO2 for these enhanced oil recovery operations using CO2 to grow. And finally, we talk about how this needs to be subsidized because frankly, it's not economic. And then after that, we move into the how this relates to climate mitigation strategy and some of the health effects of CO2 EOR. And just so you understand, this report has many footnotes, is fully supported, and understanding that reporters need to have their facts checked we've provided a great deal of background information in the form of footnotes, supporting everything we're saying. And in terms of the overall theme of the report, that enhanced oil recovery, is one of the potential futures for the oil industry, but it's not economic. And that the oil industry had two basic hurdles to using enhanced oil recovery. First, that there wasn't enough CO2 in natural sources to expand enhanced oil recovery using CO2 substantially. And second, that the CO2 is too expensive to make enhanced oil recovery operations broadly economic. Those two hurdles, the lack of CO2 and the lack of affordable CO2, could only be addressed through federal subsidies. And in this regard, the federal 45Q tax credit has been expanded. It was introduced in 2008. It was $10 per metric ton for enhanced oil recovery. It was increased to, I believe, $35 per metric ton in 2018. And now it's at $60 per metric ton after passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. At $60 per metric ton, essentially the federal government would be providing carbon dioxide for free. So, the reason that carbon dioxide is used is because it's a very good solvent when it's in a liquid or what's called a supercritical form. And in order to get the oil out of very old oil fields, the very last dregs of the oil out of those oil fields, many of which have been fully exploited in the United States, there's some need for chemical substances. Heat can be used too. It's also very expensive, but there's a need for chemical substances. And frankly, the only chemical substance that's available potentially at large enough volumes to make enhanced oil recovery be widespread used is liquid or supercritical CO2. But as I said, it's very expensive. And so the oil industry lobbied to get the 45Q tax credit high enough to the point where the federal government is now paying for CO2. At the same time, the oil industry then gets to say that they're working for the environment while using the CO2 they're capturing to get oil out of the ground. And frankly, the amount of carbon released from burning the oil that's extracted using CO2 enhanced oil recovery is the amount of carbon that's from burning the oil is much greater than the carbon that's put underground. So when CO2 is used, captured CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery, there's net benefits to the climate. And Cassandra will go into that. So that's the overall, like I said, these thoughts, this reality is not something that we invented. This is something that the studies reports we put in there from the oil industry itself recognize as being the case. So we hope that you look at this report carefully, look at the footnotes, and realize that everything is very carefully footnoted and supported. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sandra to talk about the climate change, lack of climate change benefits. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to share findings of our investigation into the use of EOR as a climate mitigation strategy. And in a line, we find that carbon capture and storage in the service of oil recovery is not a good faith mitigation strategy for the climate crisis. Instead, it's a climate problem dressed up as a climate solution. I think the best way to understand CO2 EOR is to say it's the new fracking. So if you'll let me rewind the tape for a second here to the year 2009, when fracking was first making headlines, we can see the same script with different nouns playing out. Like EOR, fracking was a long-used tool by the fossil fuel industry to force oil and gas out of the ground that would otherwise be stuck inside of rocks. And as awareness of the climate crisis grew in the early 2000s, fracking underwent a makeover and a rebranding and emerged as a so-called solution instead of a problem. In the language of the day, if you might remember, fracking was called the bridge to the future, the bridge to renewables. And in fact, we now understand that North American fracking operations set in motion spiking global methane emissions and basically threw gasoline on the flames of the crisis. And all of this was enabled by the cheap credit available after the economic swoon of the 2008-2009. So back to the present moment, we now see another old technique long used by the oil industry to force stubborn crude oil out of the rocks. by pumping it not full of water to shatter the shale, which is what fracking does, but instead pump it full of a solvent in the form of liquefied CO2. And that technique is also now undergoing a parallel public relations makeover, and it's being rebranded as a climate solution using the language of incarceration. We're going to capture the CO2 and store it in depleted oil fields, which serve as a kind of maximum security prison, according to the language of industry. And instead of running on cheap credit, EOR, as Paul describes very thoroughly in this report, it's enabled by tax subsidies. And so we find three main reasons why CO2 EOR is not a serious climate mitigation strategy, and like fracking before it, makes everything worse instead of better. And these are explicated at length in the report. I'll just mention them quickly now. First of all, and this is underscoring the point Paul already made, that CO2 EOR suffers from incomplete emissions accounting. So the sort of simple bottom line is that burning the oil recovered using CO2 EOR generally emits 2 to 3 times as much CO2 as is kept underground during CO2 EOR operations. So even if enhanced oil recovery operations were entirely leak-proof, which they are not, and all of the captured carbon is eternally sequestered in the spaces into which they are injected, those molecules of CO2 serve to displace molecules of crude oil, which by design rise to the surface, and the downstream carbon emissions from burning that oil far exceeds the number of molecules that you're actually trapping in the rock. So that's the main point. And then there are two other points, and one is that there is no evidence that CO2 EOR can offer the molecules that are trapped under the ground permanent sequestration. In fact, there's all kinds of reasons to believe that it's not going to stay down there. We took a look at the geology of this and can see that there are likely places on Earth that could serve as this kind of maximum security facility if for permanent sequestration of CO2, but depleted oil wells are likely not those places. We are aware that a search for appropriate geological storage for CO2 would require a years-long site characterization research. The rock has to have certain pore spaces. There has to be a cap rock. There can't be any old wells or borehole holes or naturally occurring faults or fissures. You can't do this anywhere where there's seismic activity. And none of that site characterization goes on when you're injecting CO2 for the purpose of making oil rise to the surface. And then finally, CO2 EOR, even if all those other things weren't true, it's just not a feasible tool for meaningful decarbonization within agreed upon timelines because it just cannot scale rapidly. So we have some analysis on this. I'll just mention now a 2024 analysis led by a geoscience team in London that notes that all the pathways for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees assume massive amounts of geological carbon storage that would be appropriate for permanent storage. We don't know if those even exist on the planet, but also that team finds that those projections are wildly unrealistic. Currently, around 9 million tons of CO2 are stored underground, included in these depleted oil reserves. To stay below 1.5 degrees, you would have to increase that by 1,000-fold in less than 3 decades, a rapid scaling that team refers to as fanciful, and we concur. So to sum this up, CO2 for 3 main reasons can't be a meaningful tool of climate mitigation, and in fact appears to be, like fracking before it, a problem and not a solution. And with that, I will turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Ted Shetler.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you all for joining us. I want to just briefly discuss some of the health effects of CO2 enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, that we summarize in this report. CO2 EOR operations can pose health and safety risks at each stage of the process, beginning at the point of capture to transport via pipeline to the injection and production wellheads and the disposal of oil field waste. Many of these risks arise from the CO2 itself. CO2 is a colorless and odorless gas. It is heavier than air, and when released into the environment, tends to hug the ground, displacing oxygen. Sufficiently elevated concentrations of CO2 can cause asphyxiation due to the lack of oxygen. It also has toxic properties that are independent of oxygen deprivation. People exposed to elevated levels of CO2 begin to breathe more rapidly as compensatory mechanisms attempt to keep blood levels of CO2 in a normal range. But as air concentrations rise, these mechanisms cannot keep up, and the blood begins to acidify due to carbonic acid formed when CO2 reacts with water. This has acute impacts on respiratory, cardiovascular, and brain function. According to the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, a concentration of 4% CO2 in ambient air is a, quote, immediately dangerous to life and health, close quote. At this concentration, in addition to rapid breathing, some people develop visual and hearing impairments that, along with confusion, can interfere with a person's ability to respond and get to safety. As CO2 concentrations rise to between 5 and 10%, rapid breathing becomes increasingly disturbing, heart rate and blood pressure increase, vision dims, and confusion worsens. Concentrations of 10% can cause unconsciousness within a few minutes, and more than 10% can cause death within 10 minutes. Combinations of these symptoms were seen immediately after the rupture of a CO2 pipeline near Satartia, Mississippi in 2020, when more than 24 people were overcome within minutes after the rupture occurred, some collapsing in their homes or in their cars. First responders reported people with extreme difficulty breathing, seizures, confusion, and foaming at the mouth. About 200 residents near the rupture location were evacuated, and 45 people were taken to the hospital. Fortunately, there were no deaths. Added to the threats of CO2 exposure, EOR operations generate toxic waste and raise the risk of hazardous air pollution, exposures to a wide variety of processed chemicals, induced earthquakes, and groundwater contamination. For example, CO2 captured from power plants must be separated from other components of the exhaust stream. The most common way to do that, using solvents, produces a hazardous waste stream. The most common way, hazardous waste stream containing carcinogens and other dangerous compounds that must be properly disposed of. CO2 capture, compression, and transport requires additional energy, typically resulting in more hazardous air pollution, increasing the risk of heart disease, lung disorders, and premature death. CO2 injection can cause earthquakes and contaminate drinking water aquifers with hazardous materials, including radionuclides, when it leaks upward through unplugged and abandoned boreholes. And finally, produced water, the briny mixture that comes up from the production well after stimulation with CO2, contains a complex mixture of not only CO2, but also injection chemicals, as well as chemicals and radionuclides from deep geologic strata, along with a mix of oil and gas products, all of which must be separated, treated, used, or disposed of properly. These activities cause surface and groundwater contamination, as well as the release of hazardous air pollutants, increasing the risks of heart disease, lung cancer, asthma, premature death, low birth weight, and preterm births, and lead to higher numbers of hospitalizations and emergency department visits. And with that, I'll end and pass it to Jim Walsh.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jim Walsh. I'm the policy director at Food and Water Watch. This report builds on findings identified by the House and Senate investigation into a long history of oil and gas industry campaigns to mislead the public and decision makers about the true harms and impacts of fossil fuel development. From the very beginning, the entire carbon capture industry was never meant to be a climate solution. It has always been a ploy by the fossil fuel industry to make extreme oil extraction techniques profitable through a massive public subsidy. U.S. taxpayers have wasted billions directly subsidizing the Department of Energy research into carbon capture technology since the 80s. Now, due to $15 billion in direct subsidies for the carbon capture industry included in the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as a massive expansion of tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress has supercharged funding for a massive build-out of CO2 infrastructure that will serve to extend a lifeline to the oil industry, an industry that is destroying our planet and poisoning our communities. There have been multiple investigations by federal agencies about mismanagement of federal oversight of CCS technology. This includes a 2020 Department of Treasury Inspector General investigation that found $893 million of $1 billion in 45Q tax credits were claimed without meeting basic requirements to submit paperwork to EPA documenting the actual CO2 companies were claiming to sequester. The GAO had also found gross mismanagement of carbon capture programs in the Department of Energy. What is perhaps more concerning is this industrial carbon capture build-out is happening absent a regulatory infrastructure to protect the public from the health and safety harms that are reported, that this report documents extensively. Federal pipeline safety rules under the Department of Transportation are inadequate. The EPA is not tracking cradle-to-grave CO2 emissions to hold the industry accountable for emission reduction claims they make. The Treasury oversees the enhanced oil recovery tax credits in secret. They rely on self-reporting and third-party verifiers to justify billions in subsidies the industry is claiming, with no ability of the public to know who is claiming the credits, how much they're claiming, to know what justification they're using to make these claims. Now, while Congress action is necessary to undo decades of public support for the carbon capture industry, states are beginning to take action against the industry. Noticeably, Illinois passed a bill that bans the practice of enhanced oil recovery to protect their residents from this practice in the state. And this builds on legislation in California that would limit the practice of EOR by requiring carbon capture infrastructure to demonstrate actual climate benefits. Illinois has also enacted a law to help protect the residents from the dangers and harms of the pipelines for this industry, but more needs to be done. Congress needs to act, and absent congressional action, this industry will continue to bilk the taxpayers for billions of dollars and build a dangerous infrastructure to support carbon capture. The carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery scam was invented by the fossil fuel industry, and Congress must first act to eliminate billions in tax credits for this carbon capture subsidy, especially those specifically for oil extraction. This should be at the top of the list for Republicans who rail against government waste and Democrats who care about protecting the climate and public health. This is a true bipartisan solution that members of Congress need to come together on and move forward quickly.
Thank you all. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I see three. One from KHOI, and it asks if it's okay to broadcast this webinar at a later date. And what was your answer, Mark?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry, I forgot to mention at the top of the call. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A at any time. You can also raise your hand in the Zoom app here, and I will call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question live. As for this program, we will be posting a recording to the Bold, Nebraska YouTube channel, but you're also welcome to broadcast an audio recording of this program. Thanks for your question.
And I'd like to give a shout out to KHOI. I'll be doing a recording for them tomorrow morning. But they're my good friends here in Ames, Iowa, where I live. So welcome. We have other questions. We live near a lot of potentially dangerous infrastructure, which is something pipeline supporters point out. Given that at least some CO2 pipelines are likely to be built, what would be the recommendation for making these as safe as possible, and how realistic is it that these will be implemented? Let me start out by saying that CO2 pipelines are not like other infrastructure. They are not like your oil or your gas pipeline. These are, CO2 is remarkably hazardous. When we talk about a CO2 pipeline, we actually talk about a fatality zone around it. We talk about a kill zone. Paul Blackburn has used that kind of language, given the science of the plume dispersions around the kinds of explosive accidents that can happen and that we saw in Satartia. So these are not typical, an oil pipeline. We've got the Dakota Access Pipeline going through my county near my house. That's an oil pipeline, which has a zone where we might have oil. It might catch on fire, but it's not going to explode and have the kind of kill zone that we're talking about with CO2. That's the first point. The second is that these are vastly underregulated. We have been waiting for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to pass rules, a regulation that would increase the kind of regulatory oversight for CO2 pipelines. That's not done yet. On top of that, the agency that handles this, PHMSA, the pipeline, the long acronym that I just gave, PHMSA, has a bill. It has not had its the Pipeline Safety Act reauthorized yet, and the authority that PHMSA has to adequately regulate something like a CO2 pipeline is not adequate for the kind of risk that a CO2 pipeline offers. So there are things that could be done. What we want to see is no CO2 pipelines subsidized by the federal government for use by EOR. Why should we just try to make something safer that is inherently hazardous, subsidized by the public, putting the public at extra risk? I don't know if other panelists have additional comments that you'd like to make in response to that question.
I'll also say that one of the key questions for these CO2 pipelines is how they're routed and where they can be placed safely if they were to be built. Unfortunately, the industry is arguing that no agency, state, federal, local, has any jurisdiction to determine the location of these pipelines with regard to safety. And we've been arguing, currently in the court and in the Eighth Circuit, arguing that states and communities do have the right to consider safety, because as Carolyn said, the reason that nobody died in Satartia is because it was a mile away from the center of Satartia, the rupture site. If Satartia had been within a quarter mile, there's a good chance that very many of the people either have been seriously injured or killed by that rupture. The potential for mass casualty events from CO2 pipelines is simply greater and different from either natural gas or oil pipelines for a variety of technical and scientific reasons. So, one of the things that has to be determined is if these were to be built, how to route them safely to avoid high population centers. Otherwise, we could see people being gassed. And remember that carbon dioxide is used to euthanize animals and confined animal feed operations in scientific laboratories. At high concentration, CO2 is deadly. And we need to take that into account. And yet there are no state, federal, local regulations that determine where these pipelines should be located. It's left up, and the industry says it should be left up 100% to them. And that just we just think is outrageous, that communities and Americans should have the right to control the safety of their communities and not let that decision be left to the oil industry.
Paul, I'm going to turn the next question back to you. And that is, when talking about self-reporting and third-party verification for the 45Q tax credit, can you talk more about the third-party verification? Do companies need to both self-report and have a third party? What separation does the third party need from the EOR company?
Well, it's a little bit complicated how the self-reporting works, but let's first step at the 45Q tax credit statute, which requires that the people claiming the tax credit certify that they're not breaking the law, and then the IRS is required to verify that the tax credit claims are correct. The problem is that the IRS then turns to the EPA's what are called monitoring, verification, reporting and verification plans for protecting water quality. Those plans do not require the people that receive the CO2 at sequestration sites to report the entities that they got the CO2 from. It just simply requires to report how much CO2 came to the site overall. So the EPA's verification process is intended to verify that the CO2 stays on that site. It's not intended to verify that the tax credit claims were done correctly. So right off the bat, we have a disjunction between the statute, which requires the IRS to confirm that these tax credits are correct. And then their reliance on the EPA, which actually doesn't do that at all. There's a big crack between these two agencies. So the other things we mentioned, as Jim mentioned, was that tax credit returns are all secret because they are part of the CO2, the 45Q tax credits are part of tax returns. They're considered confidential information and nobody but the IRS can see them. Now, this is billions of dollars of subsidies that we're talking about going to potentially tens of thousands of claimants of 45Q tax credits. And nobody's going to get, nobody in the public, nobody outside the IRS will know who's getting these potentially tens of billions, of hundreds of billions of dollars over time of tax credits. So it's essentially a secret subsidy program for the oil industry and for the people who are investing in the oil industry. And we think that's just simply outrageous. Tax credit policy is a horrible way to do public policy. It's a horrible way to, subsidize industries because it's all secret. And that just shouldn't be. This is a kind of law that should not exist.
Jim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Paul did a great job of covering the overall issue. I think that Congress has a real opportunity coming up in this tax year to address these major shortcomings, and it is something where Congress should be really leading forward to address the massive subsidies for the oil industry through this 45Q tax credit.
Yeah, I'll just add also that the verification process for third parties applies. It's complicated, but it applies in certain times, depending on how they claim the tax credit, and doesn't apply. But where third-party verifiers are used, one of the problems is that, who certifies them? How are they approved? And also, this can be either domestic or overseas verifiers. Well, if you're using an overseas verifier, third party to verify your tax credit claims, what happens if that overseas verifier lies or, just simply is incorrect? The IRS doesn't have jurisdiction to bring criminal complaints against an engineer in India. This is, another way that it's just simply third-party verification is just simply a fig leaf over the lack of public oversight of this tax credit. It really, third-party verification just means that somebody's buddy in the oil industry will get paid to say that it's all fine, and the chances of them getting prosecuted are slim to none. If they're overseas, they won't get prosecuted, and they'll just set up shell corporations and do this over and over and over again. I mean, that's just how the industry is going to play this.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add is third-party verifiers are inherently conflicted. They are paid by the people that they are certifying, and they only make money if they're doing certifications. And this is really a massive privatization of what should be public functions. The EPA is responsible for protecting public health and the environment, and they should be the ones who are monitoring, verifying, and overseeing this industry. But instead, what we have is essentially an army of third-party verifiers working in secret under the IRS. And this is moving what is essentially the authority to protect our environment and public health into the realm of Treasury. And that is not where it should be. These sorts of oversight responsibilities should be handled by public employees, and they should be within regulatory agencies like the EPA, not tax collecting agencies like IRS.
I would also add that there is no cradle to grave tracking of CO2 from the point at which it's generated. And if you imagine the vast network of CO2 pipelines that can be associated with one project, the Summit pipeline system in the Midwest, which covers multiple states. And how do you know where the CO2 has come from, how much is leaked through that vast network of pipes that are various sizes, the 4-inch connecting eventually to a 24-inch pipeline, and then ending up somewhere, maybe in North Dakota, used for EOR, enhanced oil recovery, or sequestered. How do we know? And if there's no cradle to grave tracking, then the 45Q tax credit and all of the verifications that we might have are really meaningless. We must have a a cradle to grave tracking, the way that we do with hazardous waste. You have a hazardous waste manifest. We could do something like that. And as Jim pointed out, EPA should probably have the authority and be responsible for that kind of thing. And then that should be used to cross-check with the claims before the IRS with the 45Q tax credit. The question about have we reached out to the Harris campaign? What a great idea. And I'm sure that going forward, we will be raising this with our climate allies. As you know, there are the various campaigns, whether it's Republican or Democratic or Libertarian or whatever campaigns, have various plans for climate or not. And we will certainly be making the case with our colleagues across all aisles that this is bad fiscal policy, it is bad climate policy, it is bad land use policy, and enhanced oil recovery should be an issue that Republicans or Democrats should care about as a bad public policy.
Carolyn, I'll add to your statement that we reference in here, and I would encourage reporters to take a look, the joint staff report from Congress in April, which kind of lays the breadcrumbs out for how to follow this path and follow up on this, because that staff report with the sort of great title of Denial, Disinformation, and Doublespeak, revealing the fossil fuels industry's campaign to misinform and deceive the public about the climate crisis, includes a whole section on carbon capture and storage in the service of enhanced oil recovery, which is described in our report. And I commend it to you. I was shocked to read that congressional report, which reveals that there are internal documents showing that the industry, even as it was publicly celebrating carbon capture and storage technologies as a helpful tool for reducing emissions, it was privately acknowledging that it's expensive and would require massive public funding to make it work, and actually is unscalable and of very limited use, even in the best of circumstances. So the sort of fraudulent nature of this technique as a tool of climate mitigation is already revealed in this congressional report. And I think that's a great starting point for advocates and people working in the public interest to approach the White House and our executive agencies about this.
Mark, are there any other questions that our panelists can address?
I think Jim was gonna take one other one. I'm not sure. I saw one about other uses for CO2 beyond EOR.
Yeah, I can just jump in. Carbon capture is not a climate solution. It's a ploy by the oil and gas industry to heavily subsidize drilling for oil. And so if industries need carbon dioxide for certain practices like making our sodas fizzy, they should not rely on a massive public subsidies to do so. And we don't need a massive infrastructure system in order to accomplish that. This is not a climate solution. And addressing the climate solution really means getting to the root of the problem, which is ending fossil fuels and not increasing them. And so when we're looking at, are there other uses of carbon dioxide? Not as a climate solution. This creates a tremendous health and safety risk, costs billions of dollars solely for the benefit of the oil and gas industry. And we should be turning the page on this industry and really working to dedicate those billions of dollars in resources to actually developing the clean energy infrastructure we need to address the climate crisis and the litany of harms this industry causes.
Thank you. And with that powerful and resounding note, Mark, are there any other housekeeping details that we need to address before we close this press briefing?
I will just ask the attendees if there are any other questions from members of the media. Raise your hand or type it in the chat now. Hearing none, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's program. A recording of this webinar will be posted to the Bold, Nebraska YouTube channel. If reporters have any follow-up questions, you can reach me, Mark Hefflinger. My email is mark, M-A-R-K, @boldalliance.org. And thanks once again to our panelists and for all the members of the media who joined us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists and all of the participants this morning. Very grateful for your presence today. Thank you.